For 15 years, I sat quietly at their dinner table, smiling, serving, shrinking, hoping one day I'd stop feeling like a guest in my own husband's family. They never accepted me. Not my background, not my confidence, not the life I came from. I was the outsider they tolerated but never embraced, until the day their entire world cracked open, and suddenly I was the only one standing between them and total ruin. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 40 years old, and I've spent nearly half my life trying to earn respect from a family that thought I would never be one of them. I built my career quietly, steadily, far from their judgment, never imagining that one day my experience would be the only thing capable of saving their legacy. I still remember the exact moment I realized I wasn't just marrying my husband. I was walking straight into a family that had already decided who I was before they ever bothered to know me. I was 25 then, young, hopeful, and far more patient than I should have been. When I look back now at 40, I can see the signs so clearly: every glance, every forced smile, every pause in conversation when I walked into a room. But back then, I kept telling myself that love could soften anything. I believed kindness could win people over. I thought time would make them see the real me. But I underestimated how deep certain judgments can sit in a person's bones. My husband, Daniel, came from a family that liked to pretend they were humble, but everything about them, how they spoke, what they valued, how they evaluated people, was rooted in old money and older expectations. The Mitchells ran a regional business that spanned 3 generations, and because of that, they carried themselves as if they were made from a different material than the rest of us. Not better on paper, just convinced they were. The first time I visited their house, I walked into a world that felt too polished, too rehearsed. A place where the furniture wasn't just expensive, it was curated. The walls weren't just decorated, they were curated. And the people, well, they weren't just guarded, they were curated too. It wasn't what they said to me that made everything so uncomfortable. It was the things they didn't say. The questions they didn't ask, the warmth they didn't offer. I was treated like someone who had wandered into a private club without an invitation, and everyone was waiting for security to escort me back out. I could feel their judgment draped over me like a heavy coat. I remember sitting in their formal living room, holding a cup of tea too delicate for actual comfort, while Daniel's mother studied me the way someone studies a product they know they're not going to buy but still want to understand why anyone else would want it. "So, Sarah," she said, drawing out my name like it was a flavor she was trying to guess. "What does your family do?" The emphasis wasn't innocent. She didn't ask who my family was. She asked what they do, as if she needed to categorize us before deciding how much respect I deserved. "My parents run a small home renovation business," I answered. "My dad does the carpentry, my mom manages the operations." Her smile tightened. "Oh, so blue collar." Just like that, blue collar. A label meant to wrap my entire existence into something small enough for her to store in a drawer labeled people who don't belong here. I felt Daniel's hand touch my knee under the table, a small reassurance that he saw what I saw. But even then, he didn't speak up. He wasn't ready to challenge his family, not yet, maybe not ever. His father wasn't any better. He was quieter, but his silence felt heavier. He watched me the same way he watched his business partners, calculating, assessing, deciding whether I was an asset or a liability. And in his eyes, I never landed in the asset column. In their minds, I was the girl who didn't fit their image. I didn't come from money. I wasn't raised in country clubs or private academies. I didn't speak with the practiced smoothness of people accustomed to being taken seriously without earning it. I worked through college, sometimes 2 jobs at a time. I grew up in a house where we fixed things ourselves because calling a repairman was too expensive. My parents taught me humility, discipline, and grit, but none of those were traits the Mitchells valued unless they were convenient for their business. To them, I was unpolished. And to me, they were unkind, but I loved Daniel and he loved me. And love makes us brave, sometimes foolishly so. I kept telling myself that they didn't know me yet. That time would soften them. that small gestures would build bridges, that people couldn't hold onto coldness forever, so I tried. I tried harder than I should have. In those early years, I became an expert in shrinking myself just enough to keep peace. I offered help where it wasn't wanted. I complimented where nothing was returned. I showed up to every holiday, every dinner, every birthday with a smile that sometimes felt borrowed. But the thing about people who have already decided they won't accept you is that no amount of effort ever truly reaches them. They built walls I didn't know how to climb, not because I was weak, but because they didn't want the walls breached. The worst moments weren't the obvious ones, they were the small, quiet ones. The way conversation always shifted the moment I walked in. The way they'd exchange glances during dinners, thinking I didn't notice. The way they'd praise strangers more easily than they'd acknowledge me. The way I was never asked about my work, my dreams, or my accomplishments. Oh, yes, my career was something they dismissed without ever learning what it was. They assumed I worked just to pass the time. They assumed my role wasn't serious. They assumed I didn't understand business, finance, or anything beyond the simple life they imagined for people like me. But the truth was, even then, I was building something, slowly, quietly, deliberately. I was climbing in a field most people never even attempt. I was gaining experience that would one day become the backbone of the story they never expected to be a part of. But back then, none of that mattered to them. To the Mitchells, I was just there, not useful, not impressive, not remarkable. Just the woman their son married, a decision they tolerated but didn't celebrate. I remember one Thanksgiving when his aunt leaned close to me while we were setting the table. The house was filled with chatter and clinking glasses, but in that small moment, her voice cut through everything. You know, she whispered, arranging silverware with precision, some families take longer to adjust. Don't take it personally. But the smirk she gave me afterward told me she knew exactly how personal it was. The thing is, I wasn't looking for their approval because I needed validation. I wanted to be accepted because I wanted a family, not a perfect one, just one that didn't treat me like a temporary guest. But they kept me at arm's length, even after Daniel and I married, even after we bought our first home, even after years of showing up, helping out, and giving more of myself than I ever should have. I would attend family dinners and listen to conversations that moved around me like I wasn't even there. I would bring thoughtful gifts and receive the kind of thank you that feels more obligatory than genuine. I would laugh at jokes I didn't understand because no one bothered bringing me into the story. I was an accessory, silent, decorative, unimportant. And you'd think after years of that I would have grown numb, but silence doesn't quiet the truth. You feel it every time. You feel the exclusion, you feel the rejection, you feel the difference. And yet I kept going. I did it for Daniel. I did it for the hope of something better. I did it because walking away felt like giving up, and I wasn't raised to quit on people. But the irony, the unbelievable twist none of us saw coming, was that the very woman they dismissed, minimized, and pushed aside would one day become the only person capable of keeping their world from falling apart. They didn't know it then. Neither did I, but life has a way of rewriting stories in the most unexpected ways. And this one was only just beginning. I remember the first time I realized that being married into this family wasn't going to be the fairy tale I had imagined. My husband, Mark, was my high school sweetheart, charming, funny, and endlessly supportive. But the moment I walked into his family home as his wife, I felt the weight of silent judgment pressing down on me. It wasn't one single moment of cruelty. It was the quiet, insidious type that seeps into your soul over years. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just nerves, or that maybe, with time, they'd warm up to me. I was wrong. Every holiday, every Sunday brunch, every family gathering felt like a subtle test I was destined to fail. I learned early on that my taste in clothes was too modern, my cooking was not traditional enough, and my laugh was somehow too loud. When I suggested a new recipe for Thanksgiving, my mother in law, Sylvia, would barely hide a grimace as she said, "Oh, that's different." My husband would squeeze my hand under the table, offering silent support, but I could see the disappointment in his family's eyes. They weren't outwardly cruel, not in the way that makes headlines or becomes gossip fodder, but they had perfected the art of making someone feel invisible. I spent years trying to find a balance, trying to be acceptable without losing myself. I changed my cooking style to match Sylvia. I toned down my wardrobe and I laughed when they laughed, even if their jokes weren't funny. I wanted more than anything to be seen as part of the family. Yet, no matter what I did, I remained on the periphery, the other woman in their family portrait. Mark's younger brother, Jason, would sometimes drop small remarks, thinking they were jokes. "You'll never understand our way of doing things," he would say, smirking. I tried to ignore it, but inside, I felt the sting every single time. The years rolled on, each one blending into the next, punctuated by quiet moments of isolation. I'd watch as the family laughed together over inside jokes I would never understand, and I felt a pang of longing for a place that seemed forever out of reach. I didn't talk about it much with friends outside the family because, honestly, I didn't want to seem weak or incapable of handling married life. Instead, I bottled everything up, speaking only to Mark, who always reassured me. "They'll come around, I promise, just give them time." But the time came and went, and nothing changed. Even when I got pregnant with our first child, I hoped this would bridge the gap. Maybe they would finally see me as part of the family, as someone who could nurture the next generation. Instead, it brought a new type of scrutiny. Every decision I made, from what I ate to how I dressed, to the way I spoke to Mark, was analyzed, critiqued, and silently judged. I felt trapped in a cycle: try, fail, adjust, repeat. And I began to wonder if the love I had for this family would ever be reciprocated. During these years, I also had to learn the art of smiling through invisibility. I had moments of doubt, questioning why I had even married into this family. Sometimes I would cry quietly in the bathroom after a gathering, gripping the sink and whispering to myself, "I am enough." That became my mantra. I had to convince myself daily that their lack of acceptance did not define my worth, because if I didn't, I would have crumbled entirely. And yet, despite it all, I stayed. I stayed for Mark, for our children, and because deep down I believed that if I kept being the person I was, kind, resilient, determined, eventually something would shift. I didn't know how or when, but I held onto that fragile hope. Those years of rejection, as painful as they were, taught me resilience, patience, and the strength to survive in a place where I was never truly welcomed. Little did I know those very qualities, resilience, patience, determination, would become exactly what the family would need when everything they had built started to crumble. It happened quietly at first, like a slow leak you don't notice until the basement is flooded. The family business, Mark's father's pride and joy, a regional manufacturing company that had been in his family for generations, began showing cracks that no one wanted to admit. Orders were late, bills were piling up, and there were whispers among employees about layoffs. I could see the tension in Mark's father, Richard, who was always so composed and meticulous, and I could feel the panic simmering just beneath the surface in his siblings. I wasn't part of the business, at least officially, but living in this family, I couldn't help but notice. I saw the long nights Richard spent in his office, his tie loosened, hair messy, shoulders slumped in frustration. I watched as Mark's older brother, the so called heir apparent, made impulsive decisions that only worsened the situation. Meetings ended with raised voices and slammed doors, but no solutions. The air in their home grew heavy with unspoken fear. I remember the first time Mark came to me, late one evening, the stress etched into every line of his face. "They don't know what to do, Sarah," he whispered, almost as if speaking aloud might make it more real. "I don't know if they can save it, and I don't know if they'll listen to me either." It was in that moment that I realized something. I had spent years being overlooked, dismissed, quietly judged, but I had skills, experience, and ideas. Before I married into this family, I had spent a decade managing operations for a mid sized company, navigating budgets, negotiating contracts, and turning failing projects into profitable ventures. It was something I rarely spoke of, after all. What good would it do to brag in a house where I wasn't even fully accepted? But now, the knowledge I had tucked away quietly in my mind suddenly felt like a lifeline. I approached Mark cautiously, knowing how sensitive his family could be. Maybe I can help, I said, my voice steady despite the nervous flutter in my chest. He looked at me, a mix of hope and doubt in his eyes, and nodded. If anyone can, it's you, he said softly. That was the first time in years I felt like my presence could mean more than just being an outsider. The next day, I asked to meet with Richard alone. I remember walking into his office, palms slightly sweaty, and laying out my observations: missed deadlines, inefficiencies in the supply chain, cash flow issues, and employee morale problems. I could see his skeptical frown, the one I had memorized over the years whenever I dared offer an opinion. But I also saw something else, a glimmer of curiosity. Have you tried this before? He asked cautiously, leaning back in his chair. Yes, I said, carefully explaining a strategy I had used in my previous role. It worked for a company about this size in a very similar situation. If you're willing to follow my approach step by step, we can stabilize things at least long enough to turn things around. There was a long silence. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, battling ego, pride, and desperation. Finally, he nodded. All right, we'll try it your way, but no mistakes, Sarah, no excuses. It felt surreal. After years of being ignored, underestimated, and subtly sidelined, I suddenly had a seat at the table where real decisions were being made. And not just a seat, but the responsibility to save the very thing this family had built, something I had once thought I'd never belong to. I dove in immediately, working late nights, analyzing financial statements, renegotiating contracts, and streamlining operations. It wasn't easy. There were endless challenges: resistance from employees loyal to the old ways, and of course, the family members who still doubted my capabilities. But every time I encountered skepticism, I reminded myself of the years I had spent surviving in this family's shadow. I had endured judgment, loneliness, and invisibility. If I could survive that, I could handle this. Little by little, things started to change. Orders that had been delayed for weeks began to get fulfilled on time. Cash flow stabilized. Employee morale improved as they saw a competent hand guiding them through the storm. And the family? Well, they began to notice. It was subtle at first: a nod of approval from Mark's father, a quiet compliment from his brother. And then, the impossible happened. The very same people who had dismissed me for years started seeking my advice. They called me into meetings, asked for my opinion on key decisions, and even more astonishing, started defending my ideas when others questioned them. For the first time, I felt seen, not as an outsider, not as the wife who didn't belong, but as someone who had earned her place through capability, resilience, and determination. Once I stepped into the business, it became painfully clear how much they had underestimated me. At first, I thought it was just a matter of professional expertise. They needed someone who could fix operational problems. But over time, I realized the deeper, more subtle shift was happening. I was becoming indispensable to the family itself. And the irony was not lost on me. The same people who had dismissed me, ignored my presence, and subtly excluded me for years were now turning to me as their lifeline. It started with small things. Richard, my father in law, would ask me to review contracts before signing. My brother in law, Jason, who had once made snide remarks about my abilities, now consulted me on strategic decisions. Even Sylvia, my mother in law, who had long regarded me as too modern and not quite right, began asking me for advice on day to day operations, sometimes subtly, sometimes openly. It was strange, even surreal, to see the shift. I could feel the quiet tension in the room as they adjusted to the fact that I was not just capable, but perhaps the most capable person in that house. I didn't let it go to my head. I still approached every decision with caution and humility, knowing that one wrong move could undo months of progress. But the difference now was in how they treated me. There was a begrudging respect forming, the kind that comes from realizing that no matter how much you might wish otherwise, this person is crucial to your survival. The turning point came during a critical board meeting. We had just secured a major contract that could save the company from bankruptcy, but it required everyone to agree on a risky investment plan. Jason was hesitant, Richard was nervous, and the rest of the family was split. I presented the strategy clearly, laying out every detail, the risks, the contingencies, and the potential payoff. I could see the doubt in their eyes, the internal struggle between ego and necessity. When I finished, there was silence. And then something remarkable happened. Richard nodded slowly, looking at me with something between relief and admiration. "Do it your way, Sarah," he said quietly. "We trust you." I felt a mix of pride and disbelief. After all these years of being dismissed, judged, and excluded, I had earned their trust, not because I had demanded it, but because circumstances had forced them to see my value. And yet, the shift in dynamics wasn't just professional, it was personal. Family dinners started to change subtly. The jokes that had once excluded me now included me. Conversations that had once passed me by now sought my opinion. Even the subtle criticism I had endured for years faded into something more collaborative. It wasn't perfect, of course, old habits die hard, but the tension that had defined my life with this family for so long was slowly easing. And then came the test. The company faced an unexpected crisis. A supplier defaulted, threatening to derail everything we had worked so hard to rebuild. Panic rippled through the family. In the past, this would have been a disaster, an argument waiting to happen. But now, all eyes turned to me. I remember standing in the office, looking at each of them, my husband, his father, his siblings, and realizing something profound. For the first time, I was not the outsider. I was not the one who needed acceptance. I was the anchor, the person they relied on, the one who could stabilize the chaos. I calmly outlined the contingency plan, delegating tasks, renegotiating contracts, and securing an alternative supplier. Everyone followed my lead, and together we managed to navigate the crisis without losing a single client. The relief was palpable. Richard clasped my hand that evening and whispered, "We couldn't have done this without you, Sarah." It was a moment that brought tears to my eyes, not because of pride, but because of the journey it had taken to get here. The years of rejection, the silent endurance, the countless moments of feeling invisible, all of it had led to this. I had transformed from the woman who was never accepted into the woman who was essential, not just to the business, but to the family itself. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't understood before. Acceptance is not always given. Sometimes it must be earned, not through submission or conformity, but through the quiet strength of persistence, capability, and integrity. I hadn't changed who I was to fit in. I had stayed true to myself, and in doing so, I became someone they could no longer ignore. The days that followed the crisis were unlike anything I had experienced in all the years I had been part of this family. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the house shifted, not just professionally, but personally. The subtle barriers, the invisible lines that had kept me on the outside, were disappearing. They weren't just acknowledging my work anymore, they were acknowledging me. It started in small ways. Sylvia, my mother in law, who had once criticized everything about me from the way I dressed to the way I spoke, began asking for my opinion on family matters outside the business. She wanted to know how I handled Mark's stress, or how I organized holidays, or even my thoughts on raising our children. At first, I was cautious. Years of dismissal don't vanish overnight, but I realized these questions weren't tests. They were invitations, genuine ones, to be part of the family she had once shut me out from. Even Jason, my brother in law who had spent years undermining me subtly, now sought my guidance on key decisions, both in the company and in his personal life. I could see a newfound respect in his eyes, a recognition that I had earned my place not through force, but through competence, patience, and unwavering perseverance. Mark, who had stood by me quietly for all these years, watched the transformation unfold with pride. I could see the relief on his face, the joy of seeing his family finally accept the woman he had always loved. The woman he had always known was extraordinary. And it wasn't just Mark. Even Richard, my father in law, who had always been reserved and exacting, now treated me as an equal partner, not just in the business, but in family life. There were moments when he would call me into his study, asking for advice not out of necessity, but because he genuinely valued my perspective. The full acceptance didn't come all at once. It was a gradual realization that I was no longer invisible. I had earned their trust, their respect, and their recognition. But more importantly, I had earned my own. For years, I had questioned whether I was enough, whether I belonged, whether I could survive the constant subtle judgment. And now I knew, not only had I survived, I had flourished. Looking back, I see those years of rejection as a crucible. They tested me in ways I never imagined, forcing me to develop resilience, patience, and a quiet confidence in my abilities. I learned that being accepted isn't always about changing yourself to fit others' expectations. It's about staying true to who you are and proving your value through action and integrity. The family that once ignored me now leaned on me, not just as a professional savior, but as a trusted member of the household. They celebrated my successes, sought my counsel, and included me in every facet of family life. And while there were still occasional reminders of the past, they no longer defined my place in their world. One evening, after a particularly successful board meeting that saved another critical client for the company, I found myself sitting at the dinner table with the family, laughing at a joke I had made, a joke they actually laughed at, and I realized something profound. I had arrived, not because I had conformed or compromised, but because I had endured, worked, and remained steadfast. I had turned the narrative of exclusion into one of influence, respect, and belonging. And in that moment, I finally felt a sense of peace. I was no longer just Mark's wife or the outsider who had once been dismissed. I was Sarah, a woman who had transformed a family's future, earned their acceptance, and most importantly, discovered the depth of her own strength. Years of rejection had led to years of recognition, and the journey, though painful, had been worth every moment. I had become essential, not only to the family and their business, but to myself. And that, I realized, was the most powerful acceptance of all.